Okay, so I want to talk to you about Node-RED, which is a piece of software written in JavaScript that is also a JavaScript development environment. And they call it a visual flow-based tool for wiring the Internet of Things. But I've found that it's useful to me for a lot of other things beyond IoT. So I'm going to tell you a bit about Node-RED and what it can do. I'm going to talk you through the key concepts in the system and how they are interrelated, and then I'll show you some applications and some things that I've built. And one of the things that I really like about the system is that it has code for talking to so many other systems and tools and databases that it's really quite uniquely placed to sort of be the duct tape in your data toolbox. So what is Node-RED? The Node-RED environment is an open source tool written in Node.js, which lets programmers and arguably non-programmers visually connect devices, APIs, databases, web pages in interesting ways. At home, I use it to unlock my front door and to water my plants. At work, it tells me how many new customers I made today, whether everything's okay on the website. For years and years and years, we've been hearing this legend that one day visual programming will come along and non-technical people will be able to drag little boxes together and connect them with wires and make useful programs, and we'll all be sacked. I don't think we should be running screaming in fear of becoming destitute, but I do think that this tool is the most startlingly close approach to that ideal that I've ever seen. In business settings, I've used Node-RED to pull data from businesses' existing data silos and look at it in new ways. In combination with the Blink application, which I'll also show you, I've got an at-a-glance view of vital business stats on my phone, and I can receive notifications when things go off the rails. You can produce dashboard applications and roll them out for either yourself or for the management team, for the whole company, for thousands of people, and you can build them in just a few hours. So here's an example which I'm not really expecting you to understand at this point, just to give you some flavour of what a Node-RED development environment looks like. So this shows you the key concepts. We've got inputs, we've got message processing, we've got formatting, we've got outputs. At the left there, you have what's called the Node library, which is your available routines that you can drag onto your program. You've got a tab bar across the top, which gives you the ability to separate your programs up into as many tabs as you like. And the big red button up in the top right-hand corner is the deploy button. So this is a visual editor for your programming, and you drag stuff around, and then you hit deploy, and it goes live. We'll come back to what all these little boxes mean later, but that's the basic overview of what it looks like. So in the sphere of Internet of Things, Node-RED is the glue that connects all the sensors and controllers in your home or factory or whatever. So here we've got a couple of applications which are displaying the data that's been processed by Node-RED. So I can tell from my phone whether I left the front door open when I left the house. When I get home, I've got a button to unlock my front door. And as I leave the house, a motion sensor detects that I'm approaching the front door and activates a screen which is going to show me the weather forecast. And the key thing about this tool is pluggability. You can take a vast array of software and hardware modules off the shelf and plug them together quickly to produce new value, to connect independent systems, or just try out an idea. The winning ideas, you could deploy them in Node-RED as production code, or you can simply treat them as rapid prototypes and use them as a specification for an implementation in traditional code. In the BI space, Node-RED plugs into pretty much every database, message bus, and notification system out there. So what I see in the BI world is that everyone wants to be your one-stop shop. So you typically end up with a number of silos of data that meet maybe 80% of your needs, but none of them meet all of it, and they don't like to play well with each other. So I've been using Node-RED to fetch and process data from multiple silos to provide a unified view of business data. if you've got your traffic data in Elasticsearch and your sales data in Postgres and your service status in Redis, and if you want to produce some report or alert combining pieces of that, you can build a flow in Node-RED that pulls all this information together and pushes it out to one dashboard. You can also push to emails, real-time notification, or whatever you choose. And you can also use it to monitor social media, to find out if people are talking about your stuff and pick up on dips in sentiment, hopefully in time to avoid a faceplant. So, how do you use Node-RED? It's in NPM, so it's installing it as simple as npm install. It's present out of the box on the Raspberry Pi single board computer, and it's pretty easy to set one up on, say, an Amazon EC2 instance if you want to do that. I've got a blog article coming soon about how to do that. So it runs as a daemon on your Unix system, listens on port 1880, provides you that web configuration interface that I saw before. And the key concepts are that nodes are essentially subroutines that do something. I'll talk more about what something is in a minute. And flows are programs that connect a bunch of nodes. And messages originate from an input node, they move through the flow, they get processed, and they eventually generate some kind of output. So there are three kinds of nodes in Node-RED. There's an input node, which is going to generate messages. And these messages might be something like a sensor changed value. So if the soil moisture went from so many percent from 40% to 5%, an input node would generate a message saying moisture is 5%. A filter node is going to process messages, and this could be things like smoothing out the data or only passing messages if the value has changed, or analysing some data to provide extra information about it, such as sentiment analysis in social media posts, and to format. So if you've got data that comes from one system and it needs to be transformed, maybe to chop off decimal points or to put it into some kind of document structure, then nodes can do that, and they go to output nodes. And output nodes send email, write to databases, turn on lights, whatever. And you can also build your own nodes and publish those to NPM, and then other people can pull them into their flows and use them there. So a flow is a group of connected nodes. So the simplest possible flow is what you see on screen there. You have an output node, an input node, which generates a message when you click it in the editor, and a debug node, which simply writes whatever message it receives to the debug tab. So the way you build a flow is you start with some kind of input node that is going to generate messages. You hook it up to a debug node to see what it does, and then you start adding nodes to your flow to process the data and watch it as it goes through, and eventually you plug in your output and you've got a program that's processing data. And you can organize these flows into libraries for reuse. A flow, in essence, is simply a JSON data structure, so you can copy and paste them between programs quite easily. And they're also quite amenable to being stored in Git and being looked at by humans for code review. So a program written in Node-RED is able to be processed through the same kind of code management tools as normal two-dimensional text programs. The next concept I want to touch on is messages. And a message, in essence, is simply a chunk of JavaScript. There are some conventions around the structure of it. The main field that almost everything uses is the payload field. And there's another field which is also commonly used for topic. And then potentially you can have as many fields as you like. There's often date stamps and other metadata. And if you are originating data from, say, a database query, then your rows that you get back are typically going to be a chunk of fields in some kind of message object. And one of the useful things is a node can output more than one message per input message, and potentially even no messages. So you could have a message that comes into a node and goes out a number of links. You could have a message that comes into a node and gets broken up into multiple messages. You could have a message that comes into a node and results in nothing. And there's a bunch of standard nodes which are really handy for doing breaking up, recombining, rate limiting, change detection. So if you have information that needs to flow through your business processes, most of the decisions that you mentally make when you process data as a human, you can express these as nodes. The last concept I want to touch on before I get on to some applications is dashboarding. And this is essentially an extension to Node-RED, which has been brought into the tool in the most recent release as a standard inclusion. And there's a bunch of standard nodes which represent user interface widgets. So text boxes, buttons, sliders, gauges, charts. So if you want to build a dashboard that represents some industrial process, it represents your home automation, it represents perhaps your business intelligence, you can build the whole thing in Node-RED, and you can also push the data out to external BI visualization applications, and I'll show you examples of both of these approaches. The one that you're seeing here is from my home automation, where I've got some temperature sensors in my house, I've got motion sensors, I've got lighting controllers, and they're all represented as nodes in the editor in the top part of that screen, and the bottom screenshot is the web view of the visualization of that state. And that is also quite good mobile response, so it works really well on a mobile phone as well. And I've also found that it's not bleeding edge markup, so it works pretty well on low capability browsers such as the ones that you're going to find in your smart TVs. So, what kind of things have I done with Node-RED and what's possible? I'm going to talk about how to use it for home automation, some applications in robotics, some examples of business dashboarding, general REST API development, and finally some ideas for using it with social media. So in terms of home automation, as John said in his talk, you often have sensors which use the MQTT protocol to push their sensor data up to the cloud, and then you've got some logic that acts on these. So in my home, I'm using a Node-RED server that is bolted to my wall as my cloud, and it does many of the same kind of logical processes that John's doing with AWS on my little Raspberry Pi board. So here's a snippet of my environmental monitoring. Those Mauve nodes at the left are subscriptions to MQTT topics. So I've got sensors which do nothing other than publish to a topic. And Node-RED picks up the fact that somebody published a new temperature value, and it processes it to add, for example, if it's a temperature, it might add a degree symbol at the end. It might chop off some significant digits because there's too many. And then it pushes them up to another cloud service called Blink, which is a tool for making iPhone dashboard applications. And it can also potentially push out to instant notification services such as Pushover. So if something fails in my system, I get an immediate notification that that's happened. And down the bottom here is an interesting flow. This one runs off a timer, so it runs every 2 hours, and it makes a curl request to the Bureau of Meteorology to receive their daily forecast file, and then it passes it to a processing node which understands CSV, and that node is going to spit out an object for each row of the CSV file. And then I've got a filter node in yellow at the bottom which pulls out just the Brisbane forecast, and then it pushes those into my MQTT server. So at any one time, I've got the current forecast maximum temperature, And the current forecast description has persistent values in my message bus, and anything else in my house that wants to use those is able to just pull those out of the message server. So here's what it looks like on my phone. I have, across the top, I've got in the middle a couple of temperature sensors. On the left, I have the status of my front porch lighting, which it will tell me, has motion been detected, is the light turned on, is the button to turn it on. At the right, I have a button to unlock my front door. So when I pull into the driveway, I pull out my phone, I hit that button, the front door unlocks for 30 seconds, and I can just walk up and push on it. And the bottom half of that screen shows the output of my temperature sensors. The graph is something that I created because I'm fairly sure that my solar hot water system has suffered since the neighbouring building was built and is shaded, and I think I've, over the course of the last 2 or 3 months, proven that I'm going to have to move my panels. The screenshot on the right is the same information in Node-RED's own internal dashboard, again rendered on an iPhone, so it's quite feasible to manage your home automation with a pure web dashboard if that's what you choose. In the robotic space, you can use Node-RED to talk direct to hardware. So if you're running on a Raspberry Pi, you can read and write the sensor pins on the Raspberry Pi itself. If you have other control devices like Arduinos or NodeMCU around your house, you can talk to those also and read their values. And Node-RED has got specific nodes for control processes such as PID control for running heaters and motors. It's got geolocation nodes, it's got mapping nodes, so if you could potentially, and I'm working on this, build an autonomous robot which uses Node-RED to access Google mapping data. So here are some of the flows which implement some of my household stuff, which I'm also going to build into some of my robots. So here we've got data again being pulled from message bus sensors and then pushed out to display stuff. And I want to show you how that happens. This is the mess of wiring which is connected up under my house to manage all these sensors. So at the top you've got a Raspberry Pi, at the bottom you've got an Arduino, and it's reading the sensors such as the motion sensors and the temperature sensors and the daylight sensors. And then in the middle you've got a bunch of relays to control door activities, the lighting and the solenoid locks. So back to the flow that makes all this happen. The green nodes at the left are inputs from the physical sensors, and then the purple nodes in the middle are putting that data onto the message bus so that everything in my house can see it, and then the green nodes on the right are pushing it up to various output tools so that I can view it with my phone application. So next example I want to talk about is business dashboarding. And in this instance, what you typically do is you start with some kind of database search, you process the data, and then you push it to some kind of dashboard system. And again, I've used Blink as my dashboard for the business stuff. So here's one example which is monitoring business goals. So at the top, we have a timer node which fires every 5 minutes and builds a query to access my Elasticsearch document store, which has all the Logstash notifications from the business application. And it pulls out the records which correspond to checkouts, sign-ups, orders, various other things, and simply does a bit of simple processing on them and pushes them up to Blink. And then here I have a Blink application which shows me and anyone else in the business who wants to know how many customers did we get today, how many $1,000 worth of orders did we take today, what is the graph over time of our order throughput. And if you've got a new product, there's a concept called dashboard-driven development that says if you're building something, you should, before you deploy it, build the business intelligence which is going to tell you how it's working. So the bottom half of that screen is a new feature that is a migration from an old system to a new system, and we're monitoring how successful has that migration been in moving customers across from one system to the other. The second thing I do in the BI space is monitor the errors from the system. This one is a bit of a stunt in that it's more complicated than it needs to be. But basically I fire off a whole bunch of Elasticsearch queries in parallel because I happen to know that they're quite slow. They take several minutes to run. And then I stuff the answers into global variables, and then I wait until I have all the variables refreshed, which means I have a consistent snapshot of all my metrics. And when I've got that consistent snapshot, again, I push it out to Blink. And what that gives me is eventually a relatively real-time graph, sort of up to a couple minutes old, of server load rates, server error rates, and also, if I just flip back, the nodes in Khaki at the top left are instant notifications. So if I've got a condition that is out of band, if it's more than so many errors in the last few minutes, more than a certain percentage of requests being errors, I can fire an instant notification on those, get somebody out of bed and say, hey, the website's broken. Second last thing I want to talk about in terms of application is rapid API development. And there are nodes for building REST APIs, there are nodes for WebSockets, there are nodes to process data, and recently I had a project where I wanted to connect my Slack channels to my traffic light build status display, so that when something, be it Jenkins, be it one of the QA people on Slack says project status is red, then the traffic light goes red. And the problem is with Slack that its webhooks want to post to a service. Now, if you've got a bunch of random little IoT devices scattered around your building, they're not going to have global DNS names. They're going to be behind your firewall. Slack's not going to be able to get to them. So I put node red in the middle. Slack, when it wants to hit an outgoing webhook to say somebody said something about build status, sends it to this flow. This flow processes it, pulls the information of what was the project name, what was the status color out of that message, puts it onto the message queue, and then all my little IoT traffic light has to do is subscribe to that one topic in the message queue system, and it sees literally 50 milliseconds later, project status is red and changes to red. And that was something I was able to build quite quickly, and just to solve a gap between two systems that needed to talk to each other and couldn't do it. So the last thing I want to talk about is using Node-RED in concert with social media. It can subscribe to Twitter searches. It can subscribe to App Store notification, App Store reviews. So if you are deploying a mobile app and you've got, a big customer base out there, and all of a sudden people start giving you bad reviews because one of your servers went down and you didn't know, or you had a bug that nobody knew about, or an unintended consequence of your user interface. And this has happened for real to me, where you thought you were shit hot and you got 25 one-star reviews in a day. So there's a node which is called Sentiment, which can analyze the text and tell you whether it's a good statement or a bad statement. So you can set up a flow which says, if I start getting a higher than normal proportion of bad reviews or reviews that contain negative language, alert me. So that's just really a sample of the things you can do and some of the things that I've done. I haven't gone into code because I'm already way over time, but I hope you have a look at this tool if you want to. I have an example server on the net that you can poke around on. And I'll put these slides up when they're available. So, any questions?
What was the jump like going from, you write a lot of code and then they put the visual stuff in there for you, is that pretty tricky?
You can, I think you start out There's a general purpose function node that is basically a JavaScript function which receives a message and returns a message. And when you start out, you probably overuse it and sort of write function nodes for almost everything. And then the learning process of understanding the tool is how to stop doing that and use either the off-the-shelf nodes or write your own nodes. And the benefit of writing your own nodes or composing the existing nodes is that it's a lot less complicated. Every bit of code you write is an opportunity to make a mistake. So I like to think of a node as a pre-debugged piece of code which you can pretty much treat as a black box and test it and be sure that it works and then just know that it's a solid bit of code.
Cool. My question is the other way. How hard is it to jump off Node-RED? I'm interested in prototyping a couple of different apps and ideas of it, but they will eventually grow to a size that I don't think the visual editor would be good to use for.
This one here is sort of a one-page example, but you know, I think with the addition of those white comment nodes, this essentially becomes a visual specification of what you're going to do next. So if you've prototyped something in this, you can then hand that on to the dev team and go, you know, here, go write this in Node or write it in Java or whatever.
Yeah, is it easy to access all those function nodes that you have around the place or something like that?
You can select all that chunk of code, hit the export button, and what it's going to give you is a JSON array of each one of those nodes
Okay.
and some fields which say that this links to that. And in case of a function node, the function is literally a piece of text inside that object. So if you wanted to pull the code out, you could probably script something which turns that back into maybe a JavaScript program if you really wanted to go that way.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yep. This one.
Does Node-RED have any provisions for scaling out once, I guess, the amount of processing requirements per node is exceeded, clustering or anything else like that? Okay, so so that's just not one of the things it's trying to solve.
Yeah, it's pretty much single thread. I guess if you wanted to, if you had more processing than one system could handle, you would use a message bus. If I just go back to one of my slides. Here's an example where data comes in, it gets a bit of processing, it goes onto the message queue, and then that's the left-hand cluster. The right-hand cluster is coming off the message queue and getting output. Now in this case, the main reason that I use that message bus in the middle is just so that other things in my house can also see the data on the message bus. But if you were a big processing system, then potentially you would have multiple consumers on that message bus and fan it out across multiple systems. So the data could cross from one system to a cluster of processing systems via something like Kafka or Kinesis.
Thanks.
How do you test it?
All the nodes are NPM modules with unit tests, so they're unit tested. In terms of, say, testing a flow, I thought about that.
Hit the button, try it.
Isn't that?
Yeah, that's right.
But,
Refresh
yeah.
the browser.
I'm working on a node at the moment to, this example here of the orange graph at the bottom is the error proportion from a mobile API, and it's so noisy that alerting if it's more than, say, 6%, 7%, 9%, 10% just doesn't work. Whatever value I've tried for get me out of bed if it's above this, at some point you'll get a bit of noise which goes over that. So I'm writing a node which is some kind of intelligent smoothing and says, you know, if I want to have a trigger along the lines of if it's trended up more than 20% in the last 10 minutes, fire an alert. So I'm writing a node to do that, and that's a chunk of code which will be independently testable.
So just on the testing thing again, is there any way to mock nodes at all, like ones that go off to external services for testing? can you mock them or any sort of way like that?
There's a link node which can jump off to another tab, so you could reroute it to go to a fake one.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I've done that with my Slack stuff. I sort of mocked out Slack.
Yep.
It's just passing JSON objects between each of the nodes, so you can just stub in
Look
a
at that.
JSON object.
Yeah.
But basically build a new node which short circuits some external process and then sort of temporarily reroute to that.
Yep.
Final questions, anyone? 2, 1. Okay, give him a round of applause.